A cold wind swept across the open yard of the county auction, carrying with it the smell of dust, hay, and something harder to name. Folks moved around with the usual chatter, boots knocking on the wooden planks, but the noise seemed to fade near the far corner where a single horse stood tied to a post. He was a tall chestnut with a dark mane and a coat that still held a faint shine even under the grime of the road. His eyes were calm but carrying a loneliness that did not fit a place made for loud bargaining and quick trades. People glanced at him now and then, yet no one stepped closer. Something about the way he waited felt too heavy, as if he belonged to a different world than the one ready to claim him. The workers found him before sunrise, brought in by someone who left without a sound. No one saw the rider arrive, and no one saw him leave. What the workers did find was a small folded note tied through the horse's bridle, the paper worn soft from the wind that must have tugged at it through the night. The man who first touched it said the words felt strange, like they were written in a hurry yet carried the weight of years. Nobody read it out loud, nobody wanted to. The few who skimmed the lines simply shook their heads and backed away, leaving the horse to stand with only the whisper of the early light on his back. Rumors spread quickly, the way they always do when no one knows the real truth. One person said the horse belonged to a writer who traveled from town to town gathering stories and selling small books from his saddlebag. Another claimed the owner met trouble on the trail and sent the horse back as a warning. A third insisted the note spoke of a promise that was never meant to break. By midday the story had grown so tangled that no one could say where the lies ended and where the truth began. All that remained real was the chestnut horse and the quiet way he watched every face that passed, as if hoping one of them belonged to the person who had left him behind. The auctioneer kept glancing at him too, more often than he looked at any other horse. Something about the animal unsettled him. He had seen broken horses and wild horses and everything in between, yet this one stood with a sort of steady dignity that refused to bend to the noise around him. When the auction finally shifted toward that corner of the yard, a hush fell without anyone meaning to let it happen. Buyers rested elbows on fences, workers pulled off their hats, and a few children leaned forward with wide eyes. The chestnut horse lifted his head in a slow, graceful motion that made even the restless quiet down. No one placed the first bid, not right away. The auctioneer cleared his throat more than once, shuffling papers and tapping his boots. People whispered, asking what the note had said. He only replied that the owner left instructions he could not follow and words he could not repeat. Something in his voice kept everyone from asking again. Finally, an old ranch hand stepped forward, not with the excitement of claiming a bargain, but with the heavy responsibility of rescuing something that had been thrown aside. He raised his hand and gave the opening bid. Others joined after a moment, though their offers came slower than usual, weighed down by hesitation. The chestnut horse watched them without fear and without interest. He seemed to be waiting for something entirely different. By the end of the afternoon he was sold to a quiet man who lived on the outskirts of town. The buyer did not speak much, but he placed a gentle hand on the horse's neck before leading him away. Those who watched said the animal walked with steady steps yet kept glancing back at the road, as if expecting someone to appear in the fading light. For years the horse lived a peaceful life. He worked lightly in the fields, carried the man across long stretches of open land, and grew older with a calm acceptance. The people in the area came to know him by the way he carried himself, steady and proud without ever demanding attention. Some said his bond with his new owner seemed strong, almost natural, but others noticed a lingering restlessness. On clear mornings he would lift his head toward the horizon, ears turning toward sounds only he could hear. On quiet evenings he paced the fence line with careful steps. Whatever the note once held, the memory of it never left him. The man who bought him once tried to remove the old bridle to replace it, but the horse reacted in a way he had never done before. Not wild or dangerous, only deeply troubled. So the man cleaned the bridle instead, repaired the worn pieces, and let it remain. No one else touched it. It stayed with the horse through summer storms, hard winters, and soft springs. It became part of him, a symbol of a promise only he seemed to remember. And then, nearly a decade after the auction, the town woke one morning to the sound of a rider entering from the west road. The man's coat carried dust from far places, and his saddlebags were packed tight with papers, notebooks, and leather-bound journals. His eyes held the tired brightness of someone who had spent years searching for something that kept slipping through his hands. No one recognized him at first. Travelers came and went often enough, but rarely did one ride with such purpose. He walked into the supply shop with slow steps, as if unsure whether the town itself would welcome him. When he spoke, his voice had a rough edge, shaped by long nights on forgotten trails. He asked about the auction held all those years ago. He asked if anyone remembered a chestnut horse with a dark mane and a note tied into the bridle. The air in the shop shifted as soon as the words left his mouth. People exchanged glances, whispers passing through the room like a thin gust of wind. Someone told him the horse had been sold to the man who lived beyond the far creek. Another said the animal still roamed those fields. The traveler nodded, a slow, heavy nod, and stepped back into the sunlight. He stood on the main road for a moment, breathing steady, as if gathering the courage to face something he left undone. Then he began the walk toward the outskirts of town. Those who watched from windows and porches felt a strange tension settle over the day. It was as if the past had finally caught up, carrying all the questions no one had dared to ask. What was written in the note left on the horse's bridle? Why was the animal abandoned in the first place? And why had the writer returned after so many years of silence? The sun had just begun to dip toward the treetops when he reached the gate of the quiet man's property. The chestnut horse stood in the field not far from the fence, grazing in the soft golden light. The moment the traveler stepped closer, the horse's head lifted in a slow, almost cautious rise, his ears turned. His eyes fixed on the stranger with a focus that made the air hold still. The traveler stopped at the fence, one hand resting lightly on the worn wood. He called the horse by a name no one in town had ever heard before. A name that carried the weight of long roads, forgotten stories, and an old bond no passage of time had managed to erase. The horse took a single step forward, then another. The quiet man stepped out of the house, noticing the scene but saying nothing as he approached. The air thickened with the kind of silence that arrives before something important is revealed. Just as the horse reached the fence line, the traveler reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges worn from being opened and closed too many times. It matched the size and shape of the note once tied to the bridle. What he planned to say next, and what the note truly held, remained unspoken as the two men faced each other with the horse between them, the evening light fading around them, and the truth hanging in the air like a held breath, waiting to break. The quiet man stepped closer, wiping his hands on his work pants as he approached the fence. His eyes moved between the traveler and the horse, reading the tension in the air the way a farmer reads a storm long before it hits. He did not ask who the traveler was or why he had come. The man simply waited, sensing that whatever bound these two together began long before this moment and would not be settled with a few quick words. The chestnut horse stood steady, his breath warm in the fading light. He had moved close enough for the traveler to touch, yet he kept a small, careful distance, as if torn between recognition and doubt. The traveler watched him with an expression that softened his tired features. But beneath that softness was something sharper, something like regret carried too long. The quiet man finally spoke, his voice low. He said the horse had lived there for many years, working the land when needed and resting when the weather turned rough. He said the horse had never caused trouble, but sometimes he would lift his head toward the hills with a kind of longing that made the man wonder what history clung to him. Then he asked the traveler if he was the one who had abandoned the horse at the auction yard all those years back. The traveler did not answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the horse, and his fingers tightened slightly around the folded paper. After a moment, he said he was the one who left the note, but he did not claim the horse. He phrased it in a way that made the quiet man frown with confusion. The traveler said the horse was never his to abandon, only his to protect, though even that he had failed to do. The quiet man stepped closer, the weight of those words pulling at him. He asked what the note had meant. He asked why the traveler had returned after so many years of silence. He asked if trouble followed him even now. But the traveler shook his head. He said the truth was not simple and could not be spoken in one breath. He promised to explain, but only if the quiet man allowed him to do so in his own time. With a slow nod, the quiet man agreed. He opened the gate and motioned for the traveler to enter the yard. The horse stayed close, watching every move. The traveler stepped through the gate with care, as if afraid that sudden movements might break whatever fragile thread held the moment together. Once inside the yard, he reached out a hand toward the horse. The animal hesitated, the same hesitant pull that had shown itself at the auction long ago. Then, as if remembering something buried deep within him, the horse leaned forward until his muzzle touched the traveler's palm. The quiet man watched with a kind of quiet awe. In all the years the horse had lived with him, he had never seen the animal respond that way to a stranger. The traveler let out a shaky breath, then lowered himself onto the fence rail, his tired legs needing the support. The horse stood beside him. The quiet man stayed nearby, still wary but willing to listen. The traveler looked down at the folded paper in his hand. He began talking in a slow, measured voice as though he feared the words might echo too loudly if spoken fast. He said he had once traveled through towns and small settlements, writing stories for folks who wanted their memories placed on paper. He lived on the road more than in any home. During those years he crossed paths with a woman who owned the horse. She cared for the animal with a depth most people reserve for family. Her bond with the horse was stronger than anything the traveler had seen. She relied on him for strength and company, and the horse gave both without question. The traveler paused, glancing at the horse as if making sure the memory rested gently on him. He said the woman had faced long shadows in her life, shadows caused by loss and hardship, the kind people often kept hidden. She had once asked the traveler to write her story, not for fame, but so her memories would remain safe. The traveler agreed, and little by little she shared bits of her life. She trusted him, and that trust weighed on him even now. The quiet man listened, his face still and patient. The traveler continued, explaining that one day the woman fell ill on the trail. Her lungs filled with a deep rattling that made breathing painful. She knew she would not finish the journey she had planned. With what strength she had left, she asked the traveler to look after the horse. She told him the animal was tied to her past, to promises she could not keep any longer. She asked him to do what she could not do herself. She pressed a note into his hands, asking him to leave it with the horse only when the time was right. The traveler stopped there, rubbing his thumb over the frayed edges of the folded paper. His shoulders stiffened as the next part formed on his tongue. He said the woman had passed away before sunrise 2 days later. The horse had stayed by her side, refusing to eat or rest. The traveler tried to comfort him, but the animal kept watching the trail as if waiting for her to appear again. The quiet man swallowed, his throat tight. He asked why the traveler had not kept the horse. Why leave him at the auction yard where he risked being taken by anyone? The traveler lifted his gaze, his eyes carrying years of guilt. He said the woman's last instruction had been clear, yet impossible to accept. She said the horse must not stay with him. She said the traveler lived a life too rootless and unpredictable to give the horse the stability he deserved. She believed the animal needed to find a new place, one chosen not by loyalty to the past, but by the chance to start again. The traveler fought against that idea, but her words stayed with him. In the end, he followed her final request. He took the horse as far as he could, tied the note into the bridle, and left him where he hoped someone kind would find him. But afterward he carried the weight of that choice every single day. The road felt emptier. His journals filled with stories he could not finish, and no matter where he traveled, memories of the horse and the woman trailed after him like ghosts. He kept a copy of the note, written in her hand as a reminder of his promise. The quiet man asked why he had waited so long to return. The traveler looked toward the hills, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. He said he had spent years searching for the place where the horse had ended up. He visited towns, asked questions, followed rumors. The search took longer than he expected, but he kept going, driven by something he could not fully explain. He felt the need to know if the horse had found a safe life. He felt the need to face the promise he had carried for so long. The quiet man considered him for a long moment. Then he asked to see the note. The traveler hesitated. His fingers held the paper tightly. Finally he offered it, placing it gently in the quiet man's hands. The quiet man unfolded the paper with care. The words inside were written in a delicate hand, ink slightly faded but still clear. The traveler watched the man's expression while he read, waiting for judgment or anger. The quiet man looked up, his voice soft. He said the note did not speak of abandonment. It spoke of trust. It asked whoever found the horse to give him a life filled with calm days and honest work. It asked that the horse never be treated as a burden or a tool. It asked that he be given the chance to grow old without fear. The quiet man let the silence settle. Then he asked what the traveler planned to do now that he had found the horse. The traveler stared at the ground, unable to meet the man's eyes. He said he did not come to take the horse away. He did not want to break the life the animal had built here. He only wanted to see him, to know the promise made long ago had been kept. The horse stepped closer to the traveler, nudging his arm with a gentle push. The quiet man saw this and felt a heaviness in his chest. Something unsaid hung between them, something neither man had spoken aloud, but both could feel. Before the quiet man could ask more, a sharp sound cut through the stillness. A distant voice carried across the fields, calling the quiet man's name with urgency. He turned, spotting one of his neighbors running toward the gate, waving an arm in alarm. Something had happened near the creek. Something that required help. And whatever it was seemed serious enough to send a chill across the evening air. The quiet man excused himself with a quick nod and hurried toward the neighbor. The traveler stood by the fence, unsure whether to follow or stay. The horse watched the men racing toward the creek, uneasy, sensing trouble. The traveler tightened his grip on the fence. Questions rose in him once more. He had come seeking answers, hoping to ease the guilt that haunted him. Instead, a new tension unfolded, pulling him into a situation far more tangled than he expected. And as the sky deepened into night, he realized that whatever awaited near the creek might change everything he thought he understood about the past, about the note, and about the horse who stood silently beside him. The traveler hesitated only a moment before pushing himself off the fence and moving, after the quiet man and his neighbor. The chestnut horse followed along the fence line, pacing with a restless energy that made it clear he sensed more than simple urgency. The traveler kept looking back at him, torn between staying near the animal and facing whatever trouble had risen near the creek. But something told him the events unfolding now were connected to the very thing he had come searching for. Trouble rarely appeared without roots, and those roots often ran deeper than anyone expected. By the time the traveler reached the road, the quiet man and his neighbor were already halfway to the creek. The neighbor shouted again, saying he had seen something strange near the water, something that made him uneasy enough to run across fields without stopping. His words were rushed, but the traveler understood enough to follow with quick steps. The evening light faded faster now, shadows pooling under the trees and making the path harder to read. When they reached the creek bank, the quiet man stopped suddenly. The traveler nearly ran into him. There on the ground near the shallow water lay a torn saddlebag, half buried in the mud. The leather was worn and stained with dust from distant roads. The quiet man crouched, lifting the flap with steady hands. Inside lay several small notebooks, pages bent from dampness. The traveler's breath caught. He recognized the pattern on the saddlebag. It was one used by riders who traveled long distances, carrying journals, letters, or stories that needed to survive harsh roads, but it was not his. And it did not belong to the woman he once knew. The quiet man held it out. The traveler turned it over and over, trying to place it. A sharp ache pulsed through his chest, the feeling of a road from the past suddenly opening again. He said he had seen that kind of bag before in a small settlement far west. It belonged to a writer he had crossed paths with only once. A man known for collecting stories others wanted forgotten. A man who sometimes asked questions people were not comfortable answering. The traveler had never expected to see the saddlebag again, and certainly not abandoned near this quiet creek. The neighbor shifted, glancing around nervously. He said he found the bag only moments before he called for help. He had not seen anyone nearby, but he felt watched the entire time. The quiet man stood slowly, scanning the bush, the tall grass, the line of trees. The traveler joined him, a knot forming in his stomach. If the saddlebag belonged to the other rider, then something had brought that man here. Something that tied into all the shadows the traveler had left behind. The quiet man asked the traveler if this other rider was someone to worry about. The traveler answered in a low voice. He said the man had a way of turning private stories into public trouble. He gathered secrets the way others gathered tools, and sometimes he used them in ways that hurt people. The quiet man's jaw tightened. He slipped the saddlebag under his arm and motioned for them to head back. The neighbor kept glancing over his shoulder, swearing he heard footsteps behind them. When they reached the yard, the horse was waiting by the gate, head raised high, ears pricked forward. The traveler walked straight to him and placed a hand on his neck. The horse breathed heavily, picking up the tension carried back from the creek. The quiet man placed the saddlebag on the fence rail and opened it again under the porch light. The traveler leaned in. The notebooks inside were filled with pages, some covered in tight handwriting, others containing loose sketches of towns, faces, trails, and animal brands. Each detail seemed part of a puzzle. The quiet man asked what the other rider was doing so far from his usual routes. The traveler shook his head. He said the man had once shown interest in the woman who owned the chestnut horse. He wanted to write about her past, even the parts she did not want shared. She refused to speak to him, and the man left in a storm of frustration. The traveler had not seen him since, but he always expected that one day their paths might cross again in ways he would not welcome. That possibility weighed heavier now. The traveler picked up one of the notebooks and flipped to a random page. His eyes widened. There, in rough pencil strokes, was a sketch of the chestnut horse. The drawing captured his posture, his mane, even the bridle. Below it were a few lines that made the traveler's hands shake. Notes about the horse's origins, mentions of the woman, questions about where the horse had gone after the auction. The other rider had been searching for him, too. The quiet man leaned closer, reading silently. He paused on a page where the other rider had listed several towns and crossed out a few. One entry caught his eye. It mentioned a tale about a promise, a lost animal, and a note tied into a bridle. It said someone had told him the story belonged to a rider who wandered with journals in his saddlebags. A rider who fit the traveler's description. The room grew still. The traveler looked away, guilt creeping up again. He said he feared this man had followed his trail, looking for something to twist into a story that would sell. The quiet man closed the notebook firmly. He said they would not jump to conclusions. They needed more information. But the tension in his voice betrayed his worry. If the other rider was near, hiding in the trees or watching from the hills, then something bigger was unfolding. The chestnut horse snorted, pawing at the dirt and lifting his head toward the darkening road. The traveler followed his line of sight. He could not see anything, yet a cold unease settled in him. The horse had a sharp memory for danger. If he sensed something, it was not without reason. The neighbor, who had stayed close to the porch, asked whether they should alert the rest of the community. The quiet man shook his head. He said spreading fear without facts would only make things worse. He suggested they start by tracking where the saddlebag came from. Perhaps the other rider had dropped it by accident or lost it after crossing the creek. The traveler doubted it. The saddlebag appeared placed rather than lost, almost like a warning or message. The quiet man walked to the barn, saying he would saddle his own horse and ride out to check the area one more time. The traveler insisted on going with him. The quiet man agreed, but added that someone should stay behind. The neighbor volunteered to remain at the house and keep watch. The chestnut horse followed the traveler as he moved toward the barn, clearly unwilling to be left behind. The quiet man paused, then nodded. He said the horse could come, but they must move slowly to read the signs in the dark. They rode out with lantern light bobbing in the shadows. The air felt heavy, each gust of wind carrying the smell of damp earth, pine, and distant smoke. The traveler kept glancing at the creek, half expecting to see a silhouette standing among the reeds. The quiet man searched the ground for tracks. The chestnut horse kept his ears turned toward the hill rise, alert with every step. Near a bend in the creek, the quiet man noticed something pressed into the mud. A footprint. Not deep enough to belong to a heavy man, but recent. The traveler leaned down. The print was small but clear, shaped by a boot he recognized. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. They followed the prints a short distance until the trail broke into a patch of grass. The quiet man held the lantern high, scanning the field. The traveler listened closely. For a moment, He thought he heard something. A soft rustle, a breath, a shift in the trees. But when he turned, the darkness looked empty. The quiet man pointed to a broken branch. Someone had moved through there recently. The chestnut horse lifted his head and blew a sharp breath through his nostrils. The traveler tightened his hold on the reins. He sensed they were being watched, though he could not tell from where. The quiet man suggested they head back before full darkness covered the land. They needed to plan in daylight, not wander blind through the night. The traveler agreed, though every instinct screamed to keep searching. As they rode back, the tension only grew. The fields felt too quiet, the trees too still. Even the creek's soft flow sounded cautious. The traveler imagined the other rider standing somewhere unseen, waiting, planning, remembering every detail the woman once refused to share. When they reached the yard again, the neighbor hurried to them. He said someone had been near the fence while they were gone. He had heard footsteps, but nobody answered when he called out. He saw a figure move toward the trees before disappearing into the dark. The traveler felt the cold settle deeper. The quiet man placed a hand on the horse's neck, calming him. They looked around the yard, then toward the forest beyond. The traveler's breath steadied as he realized the trouble from the past had finally arrived. Not in stories, not in memory, but here, standing just beyond the light. And whatever the other writer wanted, the truth behind the woman's story, the horse's past, and the promise wrapped inside that old note had become far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The quiet man kept his lantern raised as he looked over the fence line, his jaw tight with worry. The neighbor stayed near the porch, gripping his jacket with nervous hands. The traveler stood beside the chestnut horse, feeling the weight of the night press in around them. Every sound, every rustle, every shift of wind seemed sharper now. The air felt charged, as if something hidden waited just beyond the dark, measuring them, deciding its next move. The quiet man finally stepped forward and examined the ground near the fence. The soil was disturbed, grass flattened. A few broken twigs lay scattered. Someone had been standing there long enough to leave a mark? The traveler moved beside him, crouching to study the footprints. They were similar to the ones found near the creek, the same narrow boot shape. The traveler's chest tightened. He knew without needing to say it that these tracks belonged to the other rider. The quiet man straightened. They needed a plan. Whatever reason the other rider had for being here, it was not harmless. The saddlebag left by the creek proved he wanted attention. The footprints near the yard proved he was watching. And the drawings of the horse in his notebook showed he was hunting more than a simple story. He wanted something specific. The quiet man told the neighbor to stay inside and bolt every door. He turned to the traveler and said they needed to keep the horse close. If the other rider was interested in the animal, they could not risk leaving him alone. The traveler agreed. The chestnut horse snorted softly, nudging the traveler's shoulder. It almost felt like the animal understood the danger pressing closer. A quiet man led them all into the barn. He lit another lantern and hung it from a beam, its warm glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The horse calmed a little once inside, but his ears still twitched toward the open doorway. The quiet man closed the barn doors, leaving only a small gap for air. The traveler rested a hand on the horse's neck, watching his breathing slow. They gathered near the center of the barn. The quiet man placed the saddlebag on a crate. He said they needed to read more of the other rider's notes to understand what they were dealing with. The traveler hesitated. He was torn between wanting answers and fearing what he might find in those pages. But they could not step into the coming danger without knowing the full shape of it. The quiet man opened the saddlebag and pulled out another notebook, one with a darker leather cover. Inside were pages filled with tighter handwriting, as if the other rider had been rushing or writing under pressure. Sketches filled the margins, not just of the horse, but of trails, landmarks, and what looked like the outline of the woman's old cabin far to the west. The traveler felt a cold shock run down his spine. He explained that the woman had lived in that cabin only during the hardest part of her life. She had left it behind long before meeting the traveler. She never wanted to see it again. Yet the other rider had drawn it with surprising detail. The quiet man asked if the other rider could have visited it. The traveler nodded slowly. He might have gone there searching for answers she refused to give. The quiet man flipped to another page. This one had only a few sentences, but the writing was shaky, almost angry. It mentioned a secret the woman had kept hidden, something tied to the horse, something the other writer claimed the traveler had been protecting. The traveler shook his head. He never knew the woman held a secret as heavy as this notebook suggested. He only knew she carried deep hurt and past mistakes she did not want to speak aloud. The quiet man read further, but the next pages were ripped out, torn cleanly, as if the other writer had taken them with him. The quiet man closed the notebook with a firm hand. They had to assume the missing pages held the reason the other writer came here. They also had to assume he was willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. The traveler felt the horse shift behind him, restless. The barn creaked in the wind, a hollow groan that made all of them still. The quiet man walked to the small window in the back of the barn and parted the curtain just enough to look outside. Darkness lay thick over the fields. The lantern light from the house glowed faintly in the distance, flickering whenever the wind hit it. He saw nothing moving, but that only made the tension worse. He turned back to the traveler. He said they needed to think like the other writer. If the man wanted the horse and had been following trails for years, he would not give up easily. The traveler agreed. He said the other writer would know how to watch from a distance, slip through shadows, and gather clues quietly. He might even be listening now. The quiet man tightened his grip on the saddlebag. He suggested they search the perimeter of the barn at first light, see if the other writer left more signs. But the traveler shook his head. He said waiting until morning might be too late. If the other writer wanted something tonight, he would not wait for dawn. A sudden sound echoed outside, a sharp clatter. Something falling over. The horse jolted, muscles tightening. The quiet man grabbed the lantern. The traveler moved toward the barn doors, but the quiet man warned him not to open them too fast. They listened. The night went still again. The neighbor's shout came faintly from the house. He called the quiet man's name, his voice tight with fear. The quiet man pushed the barn doors open just enough to slip through. The traveler followed him, the horse stepping forward but staying inside as instructed. They crossed the yard quickly. The neighbor pointed to the side of the house. A small object lay near the porch steps. The quiet man knelt and picked it up. It was a thin strip of leather with stitching identical to the saddlebag. The traveler felt a chill. The other writer was leaving a trail, layered clues. A game of steps leading toward something hidden. The quiet man told the neighbor to stay calm and keep the lights on. He motioned for the traveler to follow him behind the house where the tall grass swayed in the wind. They found more footprints. The traveler crouched to examine them. These prints were deeper, as if the other rider had been running or carrying something heavy. The quiet man scanned the tree line. He saw a faint shape in the distance, not moving, just standing near the shadows, watching. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He stepped back, his heart pounding. He said they needed to return to the barn immediately. Inside, the horse paced, hooves scraping the wooden floor. His ears darted in every direction. The traveler approached him and tried to calm him with gentle strokes along his neck. The horse steadied, but his eyes remained wide. The quiet man dropped the leather strip onto the crate. He said the other rider was not trying to hide anymore. He wanted them to know he was here. He wanted them to feel cornered. And he wanted the horse unsettled. The traveler exhaled a shaky breath. He said the other rider might be trying to force them into revealing whatever the missing pages contained. The quiet man agreed. But they did not know the secret. Only the woman had known. And she had taken it with her. For a moment, silence settled, thick with questions none of them could answer. The quiet man said they needed to protect the horse at all costs. They would take turns keeping watch inside the barn through the night. The traveler agreed to stay awake first. The quiet man nodded and stepped outside to check the house one more time. As the traveler walked slowly around the barn interior, lantern in hand, he kept glancing toward the window. Shadows shifted outside, branches swayed. The night hid too much behind its dark curtain. The horse followed his every movement, staying close enough to touch. The traveler spoke softly to him, words meant to comfort, but his mind raced. He wondered why the other rider had become so obsessed, why he traveled so far. Why he drew the cabin, the horse, the woman. Why he wrote about secrets and promises and notes tied into bridles. Something in the missing pages scared him. Something that made the other writer hide the truth instead of showing it. A soft thud hit the side of the barn. The traveler froze. Another thud followed, louder this time. The horse stepped back, lowering his head and breathing hard. The lantern flame flickered. The traveler reached for the barn doors. Before he touched them, a voice came from the other side, low, calm, measured. It called the traveler's name. The traveler felt every muscle tighten. He stepped back slowly, gripping the lantern until his knuckles whitened. The chestnut horse moved beside him, trembling but ready to defend if needed. The quiet man's footsteps sounded outside, rushing toward the noise. But the traveler could not move. The voice outside spoke again, this time stronger. It carried a tone that mixed certainty with threat, a tone belonging to someone who had waited years for this moment. The other writer had finally stepped out of the shadows. And whatever he wanted, whatever he believed the traveler had hidden, was about to force its way into the light.